Talking about money. Yeah, there you go. It's kind of ironic me talking about money. I don't have a job, I don't have income, and I'm talking about money and how much cults make. But I think there's the ethical, I can blame my Catholic upbringing on being ethical. Um, it's let's talk about these devious cults and how they make money. Now, in 45B, I was talking about one story where there was a rich person in the cult, and they would their normal way of getting rich was investments and trading and property and all of that kind of stuff. But the cult leaders would use that as leverage, right, to get more people in. So there was one person I knew who he was quite a charismatic guy, but he sort of had some bad luck in his life and he was down and out. But the cult leader saw potential in him, so he got the rich person to give this guy, free rent, and food, to get him back up on his feet again. So the cult leader doesn't have to spend any of the money. It's the rich person doing this to serve God, supposedly. But the cult leader uses all of this as leverage. Because when that person who might have been a salesman, probably, always tends to be the case, they go through a rough patch, the cult will fix them back up again, get them off drugs, get them off drink, whatever, get their lives sorted out, get them working again. But it's purely for the agenda of getting money. If the person sort of is if the person isn't any use to the cult will put zero effort into them. I mean, look at Jesus, right, in the Gospels. Yeah, he healed people, he raised the dead, but he didn't then go and say, right, that'll cost you, that'll cost you, and it's this subtle manipulation. It's like, hey, bro, God looked after you for the last 3 months. You need to give to God. And they do it the way they word it is very clever. It's like, God has looked after you. Now it's your turn to show God how grateful you are. Yeah, it's all this kind of subtle manipulation that is always geared into getting more people into the cult and getting more money into the cult. And then fraud in terms of saying how much money they get, and fraud in terms of how much money they say they're spending. So, if let's say you got somebody who's a bit of a, gone through a hard patch, right? They will on the paperwork say the church is paying rent for this person when one of the members is putting them up for free. It's fraud. But at the same time, these people are calling themselves Christian, right? And there's just so much fraud that goes on. I mean, the stories I could tell, and supposedly they were so brainwashed into thinking all the money goes to building the group so we can save more souls, and turn more lives around. But the level of fraud was just astonishing. But what is even more astonishing is the members are completely blind to it, because they're so brainwashed with this idea of everything they do is for the glory of God. So the preacher won't tell the rich man that they're putting in the paperwork that the guy's paying rent, even though he's getting it for free. They won't tell the rich man that, because the rich man, as it says in sort of 2 Corinthians 11, he might be a sincere and devoted believer who has been misled by Satan, who masquerades as an angel of light. 2 Corinthians 11. So I think I've covered this reasonably well, but they get income from so many other areas, not just preaching for an hour a month, or whatever. I mean, I remember in the cult I was a part of, They'd get people over from America, these sort of top evangelists, for a conference. Everything was free, for the evangelist, right? Accommodation was free, food, they literally didn't have to spend a penny, right? And they'd be raking in like 5 figures for, I don't know, 3 or 4 sermons, and yet an average person on an average wage, if I go back, it's like some of these preachers were pulling in 30, 40 grand in the late 90s at conferences, right? Selling their books as well, and all that kind of. I mean, I don't think they made a lot of money from the books. They certainly made a lot of money from the preaching, but to an outsider looking in to a cult, you could easily be deceived into thinking, oh, they're sincere people, they're just Christians, they're trying to be very evangelical, evangelistic, and they do charity and they look good. Of course they look good. But Jesus could see right through them. Oh, Lord, Lord, didn't we do X, Y, Z? Didn't we do this, that and the other? And he said, I never knew you, away from me, you evildoers. Matthew 7. Matthew 23. A long list of things. You see, Jesus could see through their bullshit, right? But the members can't. Because if the members could, you would assume they'd walk away, But some members don't walk away because of the social manipulation that goes on as well. So leaders always have to present this veneer of being spiritual, being godly, being effective, turning on the emotion, all of this kind of stuff. They have to perform on the stage, and yet they're completely different people off stage. I remember there was a guy in London, a different person, he was sort of from somewhere in Florida. On the stage, shouting and waving his arms around. Off stage, there was nothing to him. He was an extremely shallow actor, And I thought, God, he's so different off stage from on stage. But you wouldn't expect somebody to be screaming wildly in a cafe and waving his arms around, would you? But the fact that off stage, he was just such a shallow, empty shell. He was such a boring individual off stage. It really shocked me. And they are freeloaders. They earn tons of money. They do hardly any work. They choose when they quote work. And the excuses they make. It's like I remember travelling 2 hours to go to meet a leader, right? And I went to the place. I said, "Oh, I'll see you there," just to confirm that I was meeting there, and he didn't show up. And he said, "Oh, there's this emergency has happened." He just didn't feel like showing up. They don't have emergencies; they'll get somebody else to take care of things. But it's like they don't give a shit, really. It's all about money. It's all about veneer. They will only do something if it makes them money. They really are slimy, like Donald Trump kind of thing. And a lot of these sermons are very abusive. Oh, you guys, you don't love God. And they watch every penny. This is another thing. Watch every penny. Certainly these days it's a lot easier to do. So they'll have lists of people. Every member will be on a list, and it will be how much money came in through direct debit or standing order or whatever, and they squeeze every last penny out of people. Yeah, there was a documentary done by the BBC. It's on YouTube. Last 46p. About the sort of cult I was in 2011 to 2014 kind of thing, and they just squeeze every penny out of poor people. Then they're flying off to Miami, off to the Caribbean, off around Europe, off around America, and they make money from weddings. They make money from charity. Funerals. If they're more marriages than funerals, more established cults or religions will make money from funerals. Renting out property, of investments. So they'll give their money to the rich man to grow it 20% a year or whatever on the stock market. And they do a lot of these other things. It's like when politicians retire and then they get paid like £1 million in the city to give a speech, kind of thing, by some rich corporate that can throw millions around like most people throw £5 around, kind of thing. It's just so utterly corrupt, and it doesn't matter which cult it is, whether it's Bible-based cults or Islam-based cults or whatever. They're just so corrupt, they're so greedy, and yet on stage they're so believable. And it just blows my mind how devious. And the funniest thing is the Bible warns us about these type of people, and it describes them in exact detail. 2 Peter 2, 2 Corinthians 11, 3 John verse 9 and 10. People peddle the word of God for profit. People see godliness as a means to financial gain. If you actually read the New Testament, it's full of examples of this is what the hypocrites do. Matthew 23. But what blows my mind is that people can be in these cults, they can read their Bible, and they're completely oblivious to the fact that the hypocrites are right in front of them, and they don't see it. They don't see it. Because that is how good the brainwashing and the deception is. And they can even point at other cults and they can say, oh, look at this cult, that does this, that and the other. But Stephen Hassan has this BITE model, right, how to describe cults, and a lot of it is information control. They'll tell members, don't look at the internet, that's where the devil is. The devil's on the internet lying about us, and it's like, even if you've got facts and all of that kind of stuff, well, you would have facts, but it's like they won't listen, because they'll say, oh, you're the devil, you're trying to get people out of cults. Yeah, trying to stop people getting conned. But it's like the information control, right? Members in a cult can be completely oblivious of all the abuses going on, physical, mental. They can be completely oblivious to it, right? And they're told, well, the preachers have to be strong with people to bring them to repentance, and it's always geared, as I've said several times, to making money, control, and recruitment. So if you go to a religious group, and it's like, yeah, they certainly talk about money a lot, and they certainly talk about recruitment a lot, and there's no depth of theology. There's no, certain cults, they never talk about Jesus coming back because they don't want him to come back, or they'll manipulate it in some kind of strange way to just make more money making more money out of Jesus coming back. Oh, Harold Camping, he milked his cult, 2011, oh, the end is nigh kind of thing. They will milk people. Joshua Makala as well recently. So it's these same techniques that these people use that the Bible actually warns about, and yet people are oblivious to what's going on. What I call it is playing the God card, or playing the role of the prophet. Because you could say, oh, the preacher told me to do this and it didn't work out. No, God was speaking through the preacher, so it's always your fault. Anyway, that is 3 parts, I think, isn't it?